Good morning. We have spent a couple of weeks looking at the attributes of God, and we want to get back to our study of the book of Revelation. A couple of weeks ago, we finished looking at John's first vision. We got through chapter 3. And, I was able to basically take a shortcut with the first few chapters of the book of Revelation, because when you study these chapters, when you look at the letters written to individual churches, it's real simple to say, here's who's being spoken to, here is the author. Jesus identifies himself in each one of them. You don't need a lot of background because it tells you very clearly the purpose, the idea, the author. All of these things are laid out in each and every single letter that was sent. So it makes it real easy to jump in and do that. But now that we're getting into the second vision, we're starting the second section of the book of Revelation, it's essential that we take the opportunity to give a little bit more introduction to the book. So for the purpose of this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the date of Revelation, the purpose of the book, and then we're going to get an introduction of sorts to what is referred to as the heavenly apocalypse, the second vision of John given by Christ. We look at the dating of the book. And there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of, I wish I could simply say, here's when it was written and just leave it at that. But the problem is so many people argue so many different things. And there are so many people in the world who will tell you that it has to be this date. And if it's not this date, then you're just wrong. So for us to understand why we believe what we believe and why we hold the date that we hold, we really need to give a detailed explanation as to the dating of the book of Revelation. Brother Gene West, in his book, Avenging the Saints, Apostles, and Prophets, he records for us the most commonly accepted date for the book of Revelation is 96 AD. We accepted this date until fresh study forced a change of mind. We now set the date of Revelation as sometime just preceding the death of Nero Caesar, June 9th, 68 AD. Briefly stated, our reasons for doing this are drawn from both external evidence, the evidence of history, the testimony of uninspired writers, and internal evidence within the book itself, indicating the time of its writing. So Brother West, he says, look, I believed that it was AD 96 for years. And in the introduction of his book, he goes into detail as to why he believed it. All these things. It's a really fascinating read. If you saw my Facebook page, when I said I was digging into 800 pages of Revelation, that's the book I was talking about. It's a lengthy book. But he says, I believed that the date was AD 96, but now I am convinced that it had to be before the death of Nero in June 8th, 68 AD. So when you have a brother, someone who has spent so much time and tells you, I'm convinced, why do so many people believe that it's 96? What's the evidence? What's the problem with the 96 date? Well, the strongest support that people have, the reason that so many people in the world believe that Revelation was written at the late date of AD 96, is the writings of an individual named Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is what we refer to as a church father. And all that means is that he was alive during the ancient start of Christianity. He was a friend of Polycarp, who was a student of John himself. So he's two people removed from John. And he was instrumental in establishing Christianity in the ancient world. But he wrote in his book against heresies concerning the Antichrist, concerning the 3 sixes, 666. And he has this to say concerning that. And this is the quote where everyone gets the idea that it was written in AD 96. He says, "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing as to the name of the Antichrist, For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. So they capitalize on that last sentence. He goes, for that, and they go, see, that's the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation was seen at their day, at the very end, and he would have been around the late 90s. Now, there are several problems with taking it that way. The first and the foremost problem is that in the Greek, the translation of this book is very difficult. Brother West says that just because he says that was seen doesn't mean it's even talking about the book itself, but rather a copy. In fact, later on in his writing, he tells us that they had a ancient and trusted manuscript speaking of the book of Revelation. Now, if it was written shortly during his lifetime, how can they have an ancient and trusted manuscript? Another issue is that the word that's described here, and again, that last sentence, for that was seen, is very ambiguous. It could easily mean who. And it could be talking about John himself, that they saw John not that long ago. So the reality is we simply cannot trust this quote because we don't know what it's talking about. We can't say with certainty who he's talking about, what he's talking about, or if it's even dealing with the original writing or a copy. The point is, while the writings of Irenaeus are beneficial, they're useful for our understanding of first century Christianity, it is nothing to base an entire doctrine around. It's dangerous at best. Another argument that's often made for the late date and why so many people want to hold on to it is they say that the book of Revelation deals with emperor worship. And it does. As we go through the symbols, we look at these two visions, we're going to see that emperor worship is a major problem that Christ is going to be contending with. And they say, well, they didn't have emperor worship, until Domitian really made it popular and really, emphasized it. The problem with that is twofold. First off, we know that Christianity was persecuted under Nero. Now, it is true that the persecution of Christians under Nero is due to him blaming them for the fire that he himself started in Rome. That it had more to do with fear than with a persecution of what they believed. But he did, in his madness, start the persecution of Christianity. But add to the fact, as early as 29 AD, or 29 BC rather, Julius Caesar, who had died, had a temple built for him to worship him as a god. Shortly after that, Augustus Caesar, not wanting to wait until he died, he demanded that a temple be built for him. So what we see is that even before the time of Christ, emperor worship was a common issue in the Roman Empire. In fact, in 195 BC, well before the Roman Empire existed, when it was still the Roman Republic, they had built a temple to the city of Rome itself, saying that Rome was a goddess. Idolatry, pagan worship was common. So to argue that the contents of the book prevent it from being an early date simply make no sense. When we talk about AD 68, we say that the book was written at the early date. There is perhaps one simple reality that makes it abundantly clear it must have been. And we'll discuss the internal evidence later, and we'll look at more as we go through our study. But the simple reality is the book of Revelation never discusses the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not written in it. It talks about a new Jerusalem. It talks about a lot of things, but it doesn't tell us, it doesn't record for us the travesty of Rome coming in and destroying Jerusalem. Even if it had been written in 96 AD, that is only 26 years after the fact. It would have still been so significant, so important to these Jewish Christians, to John himself, that the lack of including it makes absolutely no sense. Jesus, time and time again, made reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, talked about, warned his disciples, and for a book to be written after its destruction and yet not reference it is simply not plausible. For that reason alone, and there are many more, it makes no sense for the book to be written after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But why was it written? What is the purpose of the book of Revelation? You know, when I started the study, I learned something new. I've always referred to the book of Revelation as apocalyptic literature. But that's not accurate. It is an apocalypse. And you go, well, that's the same thing, right? It's not. Between 200 BC and 100 AD, Jewish scholars created apocalyptic literature. What they did was they took unintelligible signs, unintelligible symbols, and they made it impossible to determine what was being written, what was being said, what was being discussed. It was never meant to be interpreted. It was basically, well, as Brother West points out, he said it was similar to the writings of Nostradamus, a man who made many claims, and those claims have been attributed to many things, and yet not a single one is possible or provable. He says that is apocalyptic language. He said what we have is an apocalypse. An apocalypse, which is translated in our language as a revelation, is to reveal truth. It's not meant to be hidden. The book of Revelation was never meant to be hidden. It was never meant to be ununderstandable. It was meant to be revealed. It was meant for us to be able to comprehend it, to be able to understand it. It is the revelation of Christ. It was designed to be understood, making known the will of God in a symbolic language. So when we discuss the purpose, what we need to do is look at methods of interpreting the book. And there are several. In fact, there are more than the 5 that I'm going to briefly cover. But these are the 5 main ones. This is what, when people talk about the book of Revelation, when you hear people discuss it, they're going to fall into one of these 5 categories pretty much. And the way they describe it, the way they discuss it, is going to tell you what category they fall into it. The first category is futurists. Now, those who fall into the category, those who hold this view, they say that nothing in the book of Revelation has been fulfilled, that everything is describing futuristic events. These are the individuals who believe in premillennialism, or in some other form of millennialism, because there's several offshoots and branches of that. We discussed that several weeks ago with our video by Brother Don Blackwell. These individuals, those who believe in the 1,000-year reign of Christ and in the rapture, they fall into this view. They say everything in the book of Revelation is talking about the future. Now, obviously, the biggest problem with this is that if it's all about the future, why was John writing to 7 churches then and there? It would make no sense. It would hold no value to the audience it was originally written to if everything was written about a time thousands of years into the future. The second is the preterist view. And I just totally butchered that, so y'all just ignore it the way I said it. Basically, this view holds that all content was written for the people of John's day, and it holds no meaning for Christianity today. They say it's all done, it's finished. In fact, an extreme radical view of this says that the judgment took place in AD 70 and that there's no hope for us today. This has been referred to by many in our brotherhood as the Max King doctrine of AD 70, where they hold the idea that judgment has come and basically we're here for no reason at all. You can obviously see the variety of problems with this approach. Early historical. Written for the first 2 centuries, this view holds that most of what was written has been fulfilled. They argue that it seeks to find application of the past for present day audiences. They say we can look at the past, we can look at what was written, and we can take it and apply it to us today. The next is the continuous historical approach. They say that basically this was written not so much for the first century, but for every major event. They say that the events can be everything. The rise of the Roman Catholic Church, it's in there. World War I, World War II, it's in there. 9/11, it's there. In fact, the Ukraine war, there are people who say that it's there too. They say that every major event in the history of the church is found in the book of Revelation. Now, the problem with this is it again takes away from the original intent and purpose of the book. And while we understand that prophecy can be twofold, look at Solomon. The prophecy concerning Christ that we find in 2 Samuel also applies to Solomon. We understand that prophecies are twofold. But the reality is to take a book written to the first century and say that it applies for thousands of years to every major event removes any grounding of what it could be teaching. The final view is the spiritual view. And this is a very interesting one. Basically, they say that it's not historical, it's not physical, it's not real at all. That the book of Revelation is only describing a spiritual battle that we really and truly have no part in. Now, the problem with this is, under this view, it has no meaning to us. If this isn't a battle that we're part of, if this isn't a battle that we deal with, these aren't events that are directly affecting the church, or that did directly affect the church, what's the point of its writing? So which one of these views is right? That's the question. There are some that are obviously not plausible. Spiritual view, we know that one's just, it makes no sense. We can look at some of these others, we can say, well, they do not make any sense. The futurist view for certain. But when we take a moment and we realize that there's probably a good blend of these views, that's probably the safest approach. To boil it down simply, the book of Revelation was written to an audience in the first century. It took events that they were to deal with shortly. Multiple times in the book, the Bible tells us these things will happen shortly. In fact, at the end of the book, John is told, do not seal this scroll because these things are to take place shortly. A stark difference from the visions that Daniel has when he's told to seal the scroll because they were going to take 500 years to come to pass. At the end of Daniel in chapter 12. So we understand that this was written to the first century. It's about events that they would deal with. But Satan's tactics do not change. What Satan uses, how he approaches humanity, how he tempts us, doesn't change. And we can see patterns. So when we study this book, we can take application out of it. We can take comfort and hope out of it because we realize that the victory that they have through Christ is the same victory we can have in the variety of problems we face today. While the book is not directly talking about this event or that event, the victory that these individuals have gives us hope and allows us to overcome. Allows us to know that we too can be victorious. Brother West, in his commentary again, he talks about the purpose. He says apocalypses were usually written in times of crisis or great danger. One purpose of such writing was to strengthen the believers, encouraging them to stand firm in the faith. And that's exactly what the book starts with. In Revelation 1:1, John records far as the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John. Christ revealed these things to John so that the church, those 7 churches that he writes to in the first 3 chapters, could be prepared, could be ready. He even goes, some of you are unprepared, some of you are prepared. All of you need to get ready because here's what's coming. Here's the problems you're going to face. That's the first 3 chapters. And the rest of it in chapters 4 through 11, and then 12 through 20, and then 21 and 22. These next 3 sections, Christ reveals what's coming. The book of Revelation is a book of prophecy. That's what we need to understand. When we talk about its purpose, when we talk about what it does, it is a book of prophecy. Now, this book is difficult in that the prophecies it is writing about are not directly related to the coming of Christ or directly related to the plan of salvation. We look at other prophecies. We look at the prophecy that God gave us in the very beginning in Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, I believe, where he tells us that Christ will crush the head of Satan. You go, well, see, there's Christ. You look at the prophecy of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where we're told that through Abraham, a mighty nation will come, and that in that nation there will become one who will bless all nations. You see, again, there's Christ. There's God's plan of salvation. Now we're looking at the prophecies of the book of Revelation. We go, well, Jesus has already come. We go, salvation is already available. What are these prophecies about? Well, these prophecies are concerning the persecution that that early church is going to deal with. And it tells them, here's what you're going to endure. Here's what you're going to suffer. And here's how to overcome. It ties it directly back to salvation. Because he tells them, don't fall away. Don't quit. We understand this in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written entirely for the purpose of dealing with persecution of the Judaism. You see, these Christians who were Jews, they had been used to a certain life, a certain living. And suddenly, as they become Christians, they find persecution that's growing higher and higher against them. So the Hebrew author writes a letter to them telling them, stay faithful. Do not allow persecution to make you turn back to Judaism. In the same way, Christ is revealing to John the persecution that's going to come to tell the Gentile Christians and to tell those of, the Jewish Christians as well. To tell them, look, persecution's coming. Don't turn back. Don't change. Don't leave because of persecution. It serves as a powerful source of comfort to those that would soon face unimaginable hardships. And today the message is still the same. When we are facing hardships, when we're facing persecution, we can look at the book of Revelation and say, see, Christ told them to endure. Christ warned them that this was going to come. And guess what? He warned us. Did Jesus not tell us that if we follow him, if we serve in his name, that they will hate us because they hated him? We know that persecution is coming. The book of Revelation gives us comfort that we will be victorious. Because it told them they will be victorious. And through the conclusion of these events, we see that Christianity was indeed victorious. So you have to be asking yourself by now, why do we cover these things? 2/3 of our lesson, looking at a date and a purpose for a book that wasn't written to us. It was written to a group of Christians in the first century, dealing with a persecution that is unlike anything we will ever endure. It matters because as we begin our introduction to the second section, the heavenly apocalypse, we will be interpreting symbols that these people need to understand. And if we interpret them wrong, if we apply them to things that they do not mean, we are setting ourselves up for failure. We're setting ourselves up to believe things that Christ did not teach. It matters because as we start studying it and reading it, we can draw comfort from it because we understand here's why it was written. We look at these things and there's horrible visions. There's horrible destruction, horrible suffering that's coming their way, but we know that it's a victory at the end. It matters because establishing the date and the purpose of this book helps us firmly ground ourselves to properly understand the book itself. And it's the Word of God. Without a doubt, we know that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. We know that all Scripture is capable to thoroughly equip us. We need this book to be equipped. And we have to understand it to use it. What is the second vision of John, the heavenly apocalypse? In the first 3 chapters, we notice several points. God, through the Spirit, has that which is determined, He is determined to reveal. We learned that in the first chapter. Jesus is introduced as king and the ruling authority over all. Every letter that he writes to the 7 churches, he identifies himself as their king, as the one who has authority. He lays that firm groundwork for us. The churches are shown as either prepared or unprepared. He lets them know, you have work to do or you're doing good. Keep it up. And now that he has prepared that ground, he's going to reveal to them what's to come. One thing that is incredibly important to note is how connected, and I can't emphasize this enough, the book of Revelation cannot be understood without an understanding of the Old Testament. You have to know it. You have to study it. Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, other passages, other books, all 3 of those are instrumental in understanding the passages, the visions that John is going to be revealed. In fact, there are over 130 references to the book of Ezekiel in Revelation alone. And John does more than just reference the book. For an idea, just an idea, this isn't the complete parallel, but an idea of what John is going to do. In Revelation 4, we have a throne vision that's identical to Ezekiel 1. In chapter 5, there is a vision of the book, Ezekiel 2 and 3. The 4 plagues, Revelation 6, 1 through 8, Ezekiel 5. You can read that. You can go through it. And there's several more. The entire book of Revelation parallels the visions of Ezekiel. And that doesn't even mention Daniel. You know, we're studying Daniel on Sunday morning in our Bible class. When we get to the visions, we're going to see even more similarities, even more in which God has revealed. You have to understand the Old Testament to understand the book of Revelation. You can't just ignore it. You can't just say, oh, we've studied it too much. You have to study it. Because you can't understand Jesus without it. Brother Ogden, author Ogden, in his book, The Avenging of the Apostles and Prophets. Have you noticed how all these books have similar names? There's like 3 or 4 of them that all talk about avenging and vengeance, and it's the apostles and prophets. But in his book, our brother here says, in the first section, that being the apocalypse, the heavenly apocalypse, in the first section, John observed the desolation of Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem as seen from its real source, heaven. It was ordered and directed by the throne of God. In the second section, the earthly apocalypse, John viewed the desolation of Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem from its earthly source. The events are pictures being carried out by the Roman Empire, assisted by the false religions of the world, as Satan sought to destroy the church by destroying Israel. Satan's devices were turned on him. However, as God uses them to accomplish his own will and to defeat Satan. You want to know the purpose of the heavenly apocalypse? You want to know what we're about to study? We are about to see judgment come upon Israel from God. In the first vision, what we're going to study for the next few weeks, we're going to see God, who is the author of that destruction, God, who is the author of that punishment, and how he chooses to desolate Israel and destroy Jerusalem because of their own wickedness. We're going to see God showing us how that is a victory for his church. You go, well, how is the destruction of Jerusalem a victory? Well, what can God not use to further his will? God used the betrayal of one of the apostles, one of the disciples of Christ. He uses that betrayal to accomplish the sacrifice of Christ. What can God not use? Over the next few weeks, we are going to dig deep into the text of Revelation, chapters 4 through 11. I encourage you to read it, to study it, to prepare yourself for what's to come. Because these passages are going to offer us hope and comfort. They're going to warn us of persecution. Written to the first century, dealing with matters that were soon to that would break our heart to know what they dealt with. We now take comfort. But brothers and sisters, the reality is Satan will not stop. He's defeated. He was defeated at the cross. He was defeated at the destruction of Jerusalem. He's been able to be defeated over and over and over. But he won't stop. He'll keep coming. Have you lived your life in such a way that you can say with certainty that you are a child of God? Are you prepared to face the persecution that comes to us all? Are you ready to endure? Because it's coming. But for those who are not children of God, those who have not done what is necessary to be faithful children, then we encourage you this morning know that God loved the world so much that he sent his only Son to die. And that when that Son died, he was resurrected on the third day. He now sits at the right hand of God. He didn't care. He didn't quit caring about us. He didn't stop being worried about his bride, the church. He sent messages to John to warn them of what was to come. That is the God who we serve. If you are here this morning, you've not done what is necessary to be a child of his, then we encourage you, let us sit down and study with you. Let us show you what he has done, what he is doing in our lives even today. Let us show you how through his death we can have life if we'll only be obedient. Obedient to the plan in which he has established for us to believe that he is the Son of God, to make a change in our life through repentance, to make a confession before others of that newfound belief, and then to be baptized for the remission of our sins. If you're here and you need to study, if you need to grow closer in understanding of what that means, then we encourage you, now's the time. Please come forward as we stand and as we sing.
There's a stranger at the door.